August 1983, Queens, New York. An FBI agent sat in a surveillance van listening to a conversation happening inside a house. The agent heard something that would eventually cost the man his life. Angelo Ruggiero, a mobster connected to John Gotti, was discussing heroin deals on his kitchen phone. He didn't know the FBI was listening. More importantly, he didn't know that his boss, Paul Castellano, would soon find out. And when Castellano learned about the drug dealing, he promised death. That promise would spark a chain of events that would destroy the Gambino family's leadership and change organized crime in New York forever. The rule: one cardinal edict. Paul Castellano became the boss of the Gambino family in 1976. He inherited a rule from his predecessor, Carlo Gambino. The rule was simple and absolute. Nobody deals drugs. Not one member of the Gambino family could get involved in narcotics trafficking, not under any circumstances. If you were caught dealing drugs, you didn't become a made man, you got killed. Castellano enforced this rule strictly. He had people murdered for breaking it. A man named Angelo Melli was a Gambino member who dealt drugs in Brooklyn. When he got arrested and went to prison, Castellano ordered his death the moment Melli got released. That was the message. Break the drug rule and you die. The question everyone asked was, why? Why was Castellano so rigid about this one thing? The answer was simple. Federal prosecutions for drugs carried massive prison sentences. 20 years, 30 years, life sometimes. If a guy got arrested for drugs, Castellano believed he might flip on his boss to reduce his sentence. So it was safer to just prohibit drugs completely. But there was a problem with this rule. By the 1980s, drugs were the most profitable business in organized crime. Heroin generated more money than gambling, more than loan sharking, more than stealing, more than any traditional mob enterprise. Young mobsters saw that money and got frustrated. Why should they make thousands running street rackets when they could make hundreds of thousands dealing drugs? And the more frustrated they got, the more they started doing it anyway, secretly, behind their boss's back. The tension: 2 generations, 1 family. John Gotti was a mid-level capo in the Gambino family in 1983. He was 43 years old, a street guy, the type of mobster who made his money through violence and intimidation, not business deals. His mentor was the underboss, Aniello Della Croce. He was the old guard, the man who reported directly to Castellano, but also represented the street soldiers who wanted action and money. Della Croce understood something Castellano didn't. The younger generation of mobsters wanted to make serious money. So Della Croce quietly allowed drug dealing within his faction, the Street Crow, Gotti's Crow. It wasn't official, it wasn't approved, but it was tolerated. Castellano had built a wall between himself and the street. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, far from the neighborhoods where his soldiers operated. He gave orders, but didn't understand street-level realities. Gotti, by contrast, was in the streets every day. He understood what young mobsters wanted. He also understood what he could make if he controlled the drug trade. By 1983, Gotti and his crew were making serious money dealing heroin. But they were doing it quietly, carefully, never in front of Castellano, until Angelo Ruggiero got sloppy. The mistake, the phone call. Angelo Ruggiero was Gotti's close friend. Ruggiero had a brother named Salvatore, who died in a plane crash. After Salvatore's death, Ruggiero and his brother, Gene Gotti, decided to deal drugs to settle Salvatore's estate and take care of loose ends. They involved themselves in serious heroin trafficking, but Ruggiero wasn't careful about it. In 1983, the FBI got a warrant to bug Ruggiero's house. They planted a listening device in his kitchen. Ruggiero started talking about drugs on a phone he thought was secure. He talked to his wife, he talked to his associates, he discussed amounts, prices, delivery schedules. All of it went directly into the FBI's recording devices. The conversations were clear, detailed, incriminating. In August 1983, the FBI arrested Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti for dealing heroin, based entirely on the wiretap recordings. Castellano heard about the arrests immediately, and he was furious.
Castellano called Ruggiero. He wanted the wiretap transcripts. Ruggiero refused to give them to him. It was a power play. Ruggiero was saying, "I answer to Della Croce, not to you." Castellano interpreted this refusal as insubordination. But more importantly, Castellano saw what was in the transcripts. Evidence that Gotti's entire crew was involved in massive drug dealing. The question in Castellano's mind was simple. Was Gotti operating this independently, or was he part of the conspiracy? According to multiple sources, Castellano started planning to have both Ruggiero and Gotti killed. He felt threatened by them. They had violated his cardinal rule. They had challenged his authority by refusing to give him the transcripts. And Castellano hinted that he planned to break up Gotti's crew entirely. The fear when Della Croce dies. In December 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer. Della Croce had been the buffer between Castellano and Gotti's crew. Della Croce protected them. Della Croce covered for them. Della Croce made sure Castellano didn't find out how much drug dealing was happening. With Della Croce gone, that protection disappeared. Castellano immediately appointed Thomas Bellotti as the new underboss. Bellotti was a Castellano loyalist, a yes man, not a protector of the street crews. Gotti understood what this meant. He was now exposed. Without Della Croce, Castellano could move against him. And according to informants, Castellano was planning to do exactly that. The boss was going to either demote Gotti or have him killed. Gotti had to make a decision: wait around and hope Castellano changed his mind, or move first. The decision, the point of no return. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were having dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. A hit team was waiting outside, 4 men in long coats and Russian fur hats. John Gotti sat in a car across the street with Sammy Gravano, using a walkie-talkie to communicate with the hit team. As Castellano and Bellotti stepped out of their limousine, the hit team opened fire. Castellano took 2 bullets, then another, then another. He fell to the pavement, dead. Bellotti was also killed. In less than 30 seconds, the leadership of the Gambino family had been decapitated, and it was all because Castellano had banned drug dealing. If Castellano had allowed controlled drug operations, Gotti and his crew would never have had a conflict with him. If Castellano had been more connected to the street, he might have seen the uprising coming. If Castellano had been less isolated, living on Staten Island in his mansion, maybe he could have negotiated with the younger generation. But he didn't, and he died for it. The aftermath, the power shift. Within 2 weeks of Castellano's death, John Gotti was elected as the new boss of the Gambino family. The street crew had taken over. The business-focused faction, represented by Castellano, was gone. And one of the first things Gotti did as the new boss was reverse Castellano's drug ban. Gotti allowed his crew to deal drugs openly. Within months, the Gambino family was making more money than ever before. Gotti himself was making an estimated $10 million to $12 million per year. His crew was making millions in heroin and cocaine trafficking. The very thing Castellano had forbidden became the foundation of Gotti's power. The irony, what Castellano was right about. Here's what's interesting about this story. Castellano's fear about drug dealing leading to government prosecution was actually justified. In 1990, the FBI arrested Gotti and Sammy Gravano based partially on evidence related to narcotics operations. Gravano, Gotti's underboss, eventually became an informant partly because of disputes over drug dealing. The apartment bug that ultimately convicted Gotti discussed drug operations and murders committed to protect those operations. So Castellano's original instinct was correct. Drug dealing leads to federal prosecution and cooperation deals. But Gotti didn't care. He gambled that he could run a drug empire, stay in power, and avoid prosecution. He was wrong. But for nearly a decade, he was right. He ruled New York. He made more money than any mob boss in history. He just eventually got caught. The cost. What Gotti's drug empire really cost. When Gotti legalized drug dealing in the Gambino family, he created wealth. But he also created something else. Addicted communities. Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. These neighborhoods were flooded with heroin and cocaine under Gotti's watch. Addiction rates skyrocketed. Overdose deaths increased. Families were destroyed. The wealth that Gotti made came directly from the suffering of poor communities in New York. This is the part of the mob story that never gets romanticized. The money came from somewhere, and that somewhere was neighborhoods where people were losing their children to addiction. The bigger picture, the clash of two eras. Paul Castellano represented an older generation of mob bosses. They understood that sustainable organized crime required discipline, rules, organization. You didn't break the rules. You didn't show off. You didn't draw attention. John Gotti represented a new generation. He cared about rules less and money more. He showed off, he courted media attention, and he flaunted his wealth. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti was really a conflict between two different philosophies about how organized crime should work. Castellano thought it should be a business, quiet, professional, long-term focused. John Gotti thought it should be about power, visible, domineering, personal. In the short term, Gotti won. He took over, he made more money, he became famous. But in the long term, Castellano was right. His flashiness and his decision to allow large-scale drug trafficking made him easier to investigate and prosecute. By 1992, Gotti was in prison for life. By contrast, Castellano, if he hadn't been murdered, might have lived to old age in his mansion, never spending a day in federal prison. The question: was Castellano right to ban drugs? From a business perspective, probably yes. Drug trafficking generated enormous heat from law enforcement. Federal agents focused on narcotics investigations. The penalties were severe. Long-term, a crime family based on extortion, labor racketeering, and gambling operations would probably have been more sustainable than one based on drug distribution. But from a human perspective, the drug ban was just a way of deciding which crimes were acceptable and which weren't. The Gambino family committed murders. They committed extortion. They committed loan sharking. They committed labor trafficking. The question wasn't whether they committed crimes. The question was which crimes they committed. Castellano chose to draw the line at drugs. Gotti chose to allow drugs as long as they were profitable. Neither choice was moral. One was just about profit margins and prison sentences. The legacy, why this matters. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti had consequences that rippled through New York organized crime for decades. After Gotti took over, the the Gambino family became more violent and more involved in narcotics trafficking. This attracted more federal attention. More prosecutions followed. By the time Gotti died in prison in 2002, the Gambino family had been devastated by federal convictions. Castellano's philosophy of keeping the family disciplined and conservative might have allowed the family to survive and operate for longer, but we'll never know, because Gotti moved first, and Castellano died in front of a restaurant.
The final lesson: pride before the fall. Paul Castellano's downfall came from his isolation. He lived on Staten Island. He didn't associate with street soldiers. He didn't understand their frustrations. He issued an absolute rule about drug dealing without understanding that this rule was unsustainable given market conditions. He thought his authority was sufficient to enforce the rule through fear. But fear only works if people believe you'll follow through. And Gotti didn't believe Castellano would actually kill him. Gotti believed he could manipulate Della Croce and Castellano's other advisors into protecting him. When Castellano proved willing to move against Gotti anyway, it was too late. Castellano's pride in his authority, his isolation from the streets, and his underestimation of Gotti's willingness to commit murder all combined to create his downfall. He was a powerful man, but power without wisdom is just a target.
March 13th, 1987, Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. The jury foreman stood up. After deliberations, they had reached a verdict. John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino crime family, stood accused of racketeering, murder, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. The charges carried decades in prison. The foreman read the verdict: not guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Gotti supporters cheered. Law enforcement sat in stunned silence. John Gotti walked out of the courthouse a free man again. The media called him the Teflon Don. No charges stuck. 3 major trials, 3 acquittals. What nobody knew at the time was that Gotti had paid $60,000 to bribe juror number 11. And what Gotti didn't know was that the FBI was building a case he couldn't beat. A case so powerful that no bribe, no intimidation, no jury tampering could save him. They called it RICO, and it would give John Gotti life in prison without parole. The rise from street gang to mob boss. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, New York. He grew up poor, one of 13 children. His father struggled to provide for the family. By age 12, Gotti had joined a street gang. By age 14, he'd been arrested for the first time, caught trying to steal a cement mixer. He talked his way out of trouble, claimed it was just a boyhood prank. That charm, that ability to negotiate his way out of trouble would serve him for decades. Gotti dropped out of school in 8th grade. The streets became his education. In 1966, Gotti was hijacking trucks at JFK Airport for the Gambino crime family. In 1968, he was arrested for his role in stealing thousands of dollars worth of merchandise. He was sentenced to prison. Released in 1972, he immediately returned to crime. Within 2 years, he was arrested again, this time for murder. Same pattern, he went to prison, served a few years, got out. By the late 1970s, Gotti had become a made man in the Gambino family, a full member, someone who had proven himself through violence and loyalty. His stocks in trade: gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. The murder, December 16, 1985. By 1985, Gotti had grown dissatisfied with Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family. Castellano was too isolated, too businesslike. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, far from the streets. More importantly, Castellano had banned drug dealing. Anyone caught dealing drugs would be killed. Gotti's crew was making millions from drugs. Castellano's ban threatened everything. In August 1983, Gotti's brother Gene and his associate Angelo Ruggiero were arrested for heroin trafficking. Castellano demanded the wiretap transcripts. He wanted to see what the FBI had. When Ruggiero refused to hand them over, Castellano threatened to demote Gotti. So Gotti decided to move first. On December 16, 1985, at 5:30 p.m., Paul Castellano and his bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan for dinner. 4 gunmen in trench coats and Russian fur hats approached. They opened fire. Castellano was shot multiple times. He fell to the pavement.
The image, the Dapper Don. John Gotti was unlike any mob boss before him. Most bosses avoided attention. They dressed plainly. They stayed out of the media. Gotti did the opposite. He wore $2,000 custom suits. He held lavish parties. He walked into restaurants like a celebrity. The media loved him. They gave him nicknames, the Dapper Don for his expensive clothes. Later, the Teflon Don, when charges kept failing to stick. Gotti courted this attention. He played to the cameras. He gave quotes. He smiled for photographers. The public started seeing him as a folk hero, a charismatic outsider who beat the system. FBI Director Jules Bonavolante said something that captures the problem perfectly. With all this media coverage, he's beginning to look like a folk hero. What the public should realize is that he's the boss of the largest Cosa Nostra family, that he surrounds himself with ruthless killers, and that he is flat out a criminal. But the public didn't care. They loved Gotti, and Gotti loved the attention. The first acquittal, 1986 to 1987. In 1986, federal prosecutors indicted Gotti under RICO on charges of racketeering, murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and truck hijacking. It was a solid case. The evidence was strong. But Gotti had a strategy: jury tampering. During jury selection, a man named George Pape was impaneled as juror number 11. What the court didn't know was that Pape was a close friend and business associate of Bosco Radonjic, the boss of the Westies, an Irish mob. Through Radonjic, Pape contacted Sammy Gravano and agreed to sell his vote for $60,000. Pape received 3 payments of $20,000 each during the trial. When jury deliberations began, most juries wanted to convict Gotti, but Pape held out. He refused to vote guilty, and he did something more dangerous. He made the other juries afraid of their own safety. They worried that if they convicted Gotti, the mob would come after them. On March 13, 1987, after days of deliberation, the jury acquitted Gotti and his co-defendants on all charges. It was a stunning upset, a major victory for organized crime, a humiliating loss for federal prosecutors, and it made Gotti more famous than ever. 5 years later, in 1992, George Pape was convicted of obstruction of justice for his role in the fix. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but by then, the damage was done. The pattern: 3 acquittals. Between 1986 and 1990, John Gotti was tried 3 times. He was acquitted every time. In 1987, the RICO case, where George Pape fixed the jury. In 1990, an assault case, where Gotti was accused of ordering an attack on a union official. He was acquitted on February 9, 1990. After the verdict, there were firework displays in the streets by his supporters. Each acquittal reinforced Gotti's image, the Teflon Don, untouchable. But federal prosecutors knew what was happening. They suspected jury tampering. They suspected witness intimidation. The problem was proving it. and the FBI was determined to find a way. The strategy, RICO. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was passed in 1970 specifically to fight organized crime. The law works like this. If prosecutors can prove someone committed 2 or more felonies as part of a criminal enterprise, they can charge that person with racketeering. And racketeering carries massive sentences, life in prison. More importantly, RICO allows prosecutors to charge mob bosses for crimes they ordered even if they didn't personally commit them. Before RICO, prosecutors had to prove a mob boss personally murdered someone. That was almost impossible. Bosses never did their own killing. But with RICO, if prosecutors could prove the boss ordered the murder, that was enough. By the late 1980s, federal prosecutors had successfully used RICO to convict the bosses of multiple crime families in the Mafia commission trial. Now, they were ready to use it against John Gotti.
The surveillance. Bugs in the Ravenite Social Club. In January 1988, Gotti made a critical mistake. Against Sammy Gravano's advice, Gotti required all his captains to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club every Wednesday night. Gotti wanted to show his power. He wanted his men to publicly demonstrate their loyalty. But this decision allowed FBI surveillance to photograph and identify nearly the entire Gambino family hierarchy. The FBI already had bugs planted in the Ravenite, but the audio quality was poor. Espresso machines, soda machines, background noise made it impossible to hear conversations clearly. Then, over Thanksgiving weekend, 1989, the FBI made their breakthrough. They broke into the apartment of Nettie Sorelli, who lived on the 3rd floor of the building. They planted a listening device in her apartment. Gotti had been using that apartment for his most sensitive conversations, away from the noise of the social club, away from the street. For the next 13 months, the FBI recorded over 600 hours of conversations, and what they heard was devastating. Gotti discussed murders he'd ordered, specific people, specific reasons. He talked about Paul Castellano's murder, Tommy Bellotti's murder, Robert DiBernardo's murder, Liborio Melito's murder, Louis DiBano's murder. In December 1989, Gotti was recorded discussing Louis DiBano, a Gambino soldier who had failed to show up to a meeting. Gotti told his consigliere, Frank Locascio, "You know why he's dying? He's gonna die because he refused to come in when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong." The FBI had Gotti's own voice on tape ordering a murder. The break, when Sammy Gravano heard himself. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano was Gotti's underboss, his most trusted lieutenant. Gravano had been with Gotti for years. He had participated in murders. He had helped Gotti become boss. But in December 1990, after Gotti was arrested, something happened that changed everything. Gotti told Gravano not to listen to the apartment tapes. That terrified Gravano. If Gotti didn't want him to hear the tapes, that could only mean one thing. Gotti had said something negative about Gravano on those recordings. Gotti was probably setting up Gravano's murder, making it seem justified to the other capos. When the FBI offered to let Gravano listen to portions of the tapes, Gravano immediately agreed. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. Gotti was making bitter, insulting comments about him, disparaging remarks, comments that showed Gotti was laying the groundwork to have Gravano killed. On November 13, 1991, Sammy Gravano agreed to turn state evidence. He would testify against John Gotti in court.
This was shocking. An underboss of a major crime family testifying against his boss? But Gravano believed he was a dead man anyway. Better to cooperate and survive in witness protection than die on Gotti's orders. The trial, 1992. Jury selection for Gotti's RICO trial began in January 1992. Because of Gotti's reputation for jury tampering, extraordinary precautions were taken. The jury was anonymous. Their identities were protected. For the first time in a Brooklyn federal case, the jury was fully sequestered during the trial. They were isolated, watched, protected. No contact with the outside world. No chance for Gotti to get to them. The trial began on February 12, 1992. Prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason opened by playing the apartment tapes. The jury heard Gotti's voice discussing murders, talking about Castellano, confirming his motive to kill his boss. Then on March 2nd, Sammy Gravano took the stand. For 9 days, Gravano testified. He described the structure of the Gambino family. He explained how Gotti became boss. He detailed the conspiracy to murder Castellano. He gave a complete account of the hit and the aftermath. Gravano's testimony was devastating, but it might not have been enough on its own. He was a criminal, a killer. The defense could attack his credibility. But the tapes corroborated everything Gravano said. Gotti's own voice proved Gravano was telling the truth.
The verdict, April 2nd, 1992. After a 6-week trial, the jury deliberated for just 13 hours. On April 2nd, 1992, they returned with a verdict, guilty, on all 13 counts. Racketeering, 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, loan sharking, tax evasion. Frank Locascio was convicted on all charges except 1 count of illegal gambling. The head of the FBI's office in New York famously remarked that Don is covered with Velcro and every charge stuck. On June 23, 1992, Judge I. Leo Glasser sentenced both men to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, Gotti's supporters rioted. They fought with police, they overturned cars. 7 protesters were arrested on felony riot charges. But it didn't matter. John Gotti, the Teflon Don, the Dapper Don, the boss of the Gambino family, was going to federal prison for the rest of his life. The prison. Life in solitary. Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security prison. He spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No contact with other prisoners, no phone calls, no visitors except lawyers and family. The government wasn't taking chances. They wanted to make sure Gotti couldn't run the family from prison. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. It was treated, but it returned. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. He had spent the last 10 years of his life in prison, sick, isolated, forgotten by the media that once adored him. The irony, the attention that destroyed him. John Gotti loved attention. He courted the media. He played to the cameras. He wanted to be famous. And that attention destroyed him. Other mob bosses stayed in the shadows. They avoided publicity. They lived quietly. Those bosses lasted longer. But Gotti couldn't resist the spotlight.
And that spotlight brought FBI scrutiny, it brought media pressure, it brought public expectations for his prosecution. The FBI director said it perfectly. With all this media coverage, he's beginning to look like a folk hero. That couldn't be allowed to stand. So the FBI poured resources into taking Gotti down. They planted bugs, they flipped witnesses, they built the case. And Gotti's own arrogance helped him. Requiring his captains to meet every Wednesday at the Ravenite, that allowed the FBI to photograph the entire hierarchy. Using Nettie Sorelli's apartment for sensitive conversations, the FBI bugged it. Talking openly on those tapes about murders he'd ordered, that gave prosecutors everything they needed. Gotti thought he was untouchable. He thought he owned the judges. He thought he could beat any case. But Rico proved him wrong. The legacy, the last of the Dapper Dons. John Gotti's conviction marked a turning point in organized crime. He was the last mob boss to achieve celebrity status. After him, the bosses went back to the shadows. His son, John Gotti Jr., tried to take over the family, but he faced trial after trial. Eventually, he was convicted and served time. The Gambino family never recovered from Gotti's downfall. By the 2000s, it was a shadow of what it had been. Rico had proven its effectiveness, not just against Gotti, but against organized crime in general. Today, the Italian-American Mafia still exists, but it's nothing like it was in Gotti's era. And that's largely because Rico gave prosecutors the tools to dismantle entire criminal enterprises, one boss at a time.
March 2nd, 1992, United States District Court, Brooklyn. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano walked to the witness stand. 46 years old, 5'5", former underboss of the Gambino crime family. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. For 9 days, he testified about 19 murders, about Paul Castellano's assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse, about John Gotti's rise to power, about racketeering, extortion, labor unions, construction bids. The courtroom was packed. Gotti sat at the defense table in an expensive suit. His supporters filled the gallery. And Sammy, his trusted underboss since 1986, described every crime in deadpan detail. I was involved in 19 murders, Gravano said. But he clarified, sometimes I was the planner, sometimes I was the shooter. On a hit, there's a lot of different people, positions that you play. So I didn't kill 19 people. In fact, Gravano only pulled the trigger once. Most of his role was planning, coordination, giving orders. But his testimony destroyed the Gambino family's leadership. John Gotti got life in prison without parole. 36 other mobsters were convicted or awaiting trial based on Gravano's cooperation. This is the story of Sammy the Bull Gravano, the highest-ranking mobster ever to break omertà and testify against the mob. How a Brooklyn street kid rose to become Gotti's underboss, how the December 1985 murder of Paul Castellano changed organized crime forever, and how one FBI wiretap convinced Gravano to become the most valuable cooperating witness in Mafia history. For breaking the code of silence, Gravano served just 5 years in prison. Gotti died behind bars, and 30 years later, Gravano is still alive, running a podcast, giving interviews, telling his story. The Bensonhurst Street Kid. March 12th, 1945. Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Salvatore Gravano was born to Gelando Jerry Gravano and Caterina K. Gravano, working-class Italian immigrants, strict household, Catholic values. Sammy was a small kid, 5'5" as an adult, bullied constantly in school. He had dyslexia, couldn't read well, dropped out after 8th grade.
But what he lacked in size and education, he made up for in toughness. He learned to fight, became a Golden Gloves boxer, earned respect through his fists. By his late teens, Sammy was running with street crews in Bensonhurst, small-time crimes, burglary, theft. He joined the Rampers, a street gang that fed into organized crime. In 1964, at age 19, Sammy shot and killed Joe Colucci, a member of a rival gang. Self-defense, technically. Colucci had been sent to kill Sammy, but Sammy got to him first. The murder brought Sammy to the attention of the Colombo crime family. Tommy Sparrow, a Colombo member, took Sammy under his wing. By 1968, Sammy was a made man in the Colombo family, but the Colombos were in turmoil, internal wars, leadership disputes. It was chaos. Sammy needed something more stable. He transferred to the Gambino family, specifically to the crew run by Salvatore Toto Aurelio. Aurelio became Sammy's mentor, taught him the business, introduced him to the right people, and in 1976, Sammy met John Gotti.
The partnership. 1976, Howard Beach, Queens. John Gotti was a rising capo in the Gambino family, ambitious, charismatic, connected to Enal Della Croce, the underboss and most powerful member of the family after boss Carlo Gambino. Sammy Gravano was making money in construction rackets, drywall businesses, labor unions. He was an earner, someone who brought in steady cash. Gotti and Gravano hit it off. They had different styles. Gotti was flashy, Gravano was quiet, but they complemented each other. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, Pau Castellano became boss. Castellano was from the white-collar side of the family. He wore three-piece suits, lived in a mansion on Staten Island, focused on construction, unions, and legitimate businesses. He looked down on the street guys, the hijackers, the gamblers, the old-school mobsters like Gotti. Gotti hated Castellano, and Gravano agreed with Gotti's assessment. Castellano was out of touch, arrogant, disrespectful to the men who did the real work. By the early 1980s, tension was building. The Castellano problem. 1983. FBI agents arrested Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and Gene Gotti, all members of Gotti's crew, for heroin trafficking. Paul Castellano had a strict rule: no drug dealing. Anyone caught trafficking faced death. But Paul Castellano's own son-in-law, Frank Amato, was abusing Castellano's daughter. Gravano and others killed Amato on Castellano's orders, a family matter handled internally. The double standard infuriated Gotti's crow. Castellano could order murders to protect his family, but he'd kill him for making money with drugs? And there was another problem. The FBI had wiretapped Ruggiero's house. The tapes contained conversations implicating Gotti and others in multiple crimes. Castellano demanded to hear the tapes. If Gotti turned over the tapes, Castellano would learn about the drug operation. He'd ordered everyone involved killed. Gotti refused and started planning Castellano's murder. December 16th, 1985, 5:30 p.m., Midtown Manhattan. Paul Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Pilato, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. They were meeting several capos for dinner. As Castellano stepped out of his black Lincoln, three men in trench coats and fur hats approached. They pulled out semi-automatic pistols. 6 shots hit Castellano. He collapsed on the sidewalk. Pilato tried to react. He was shot 5 times, dead before he hit the ground. The gunman walked away calmly, disappeared into the crowd. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano sat in the car 1 block away.
They drove past the scene slowly, verified the hits were successful, then left. Within days, Gotti declared himself boss of the Gambino family. No vote, no commission approval, he just took it. And he elevated Gravano, first to captain, then in 1987 to consigliere, then in 1988 to underboss, the number 2 position in the family.
The Teflon Don. 1986 through 1990, John Gotti became famous. He wore $1,500 suits, silk ties, cashmere topcoats. He gave interviews, appeared on the news, held court outside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where supporters gathered. The press called him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don because criminal charges never stuck. 1986, Gotti was tried for racketeering, acquitted. A juror had been bribed. 1987, another racketeering trial, acquitted again. Witnesses intimidated. 1990, assault and conspiracy charges, acquitted. More jury tampering. Gotti seemed untouchable, and he loved the attention. But Gravano hated it. The publicity drew FBI resources, constant surveillance, wiretaps everywhere. The more famous Gotti became, the more dangerous it was for everyone in the family. And Gravano was doing all the work, running the construction rackets, overseeing labor unions, collecting money, managing crews. While Gotti basked in media attention, Gravano built the actual criminal enterprise that funded everything. The resentment grew. The wiretap. 1989, the FBI bugged the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. Nettie Cirillo lived there, elderly woman. The FBI convinced her to let them install listening devices. For months, they recorded conversations. Gotti discussed Gambino family business, murders, schemes, and he complained about Gravano. Sammy's got a big mouth, Gotti said on one tape. Called him a junkie because Gravano had used steroids years earlier. Questioned his loyalty. Blamed him for problems. October 1991, FBI agents arrested Gotti and Gravano. Federal racketeering charges, murder, conspiracy. In custody, federal prosecutors played Gravano to tapes. The conversations where Gotti bad-mouthed them, where Gotti seemed to be setting him up to take the fall. Gravano was furious. He'd been loyal to Gotti since 1976, 15 years of partnership, and Gotti had been talking behind his back the entire time. The prosecutors made an offer. Testify against Gotti, we'll drop most of the charges. You'll serve minimal time, we'll protect your family. Gravano had a choice. Stay loyal to a boss who'd betrayed him, face life in prison, or cooperate. He chose cooperation. The testimony. March 1992, the trial began. For the first 2 weeks, prosecutors played wiretap recordings. FBI agents testified. Evidence piled up. Then, on March 2nd, Sammy Gravano took the stand. The courtroom fell silent. Gotti's supporters glared. Joey D'Angelo, son of one of Gravano's crew members, sat in the front row. When Gravano began testifying, D'Angelo stood up, shuffled toward the aisle, paused, stared at Gravano, then walked slowly out. A scene straight from The Godfather, Part 2, trying to rattle a witness. It didn't work. Gravano's resolute hardened. For 9 days, he testified. 19 murders, including Paul Castellano's assassination, Thomas Bellotti, Robert DiBernardo, a Gambino captain, Louis Melito, his best friend who'd become a problem, Eddie Garofalo, his brother-in-law. Gravano described his role in each. Sometimes he planned, sometimes he drove, sometimes he recruited the shooters. Only once did he personally pull the trigger. He implicated Gotti in multiple murders, racketeering, extortion, labor union corruption, construction bid rigging.
Defense attorneys tried to break him. Albert Krieger, Gotti's lawyer, attacked Gravano's credibility, called him a liar, a murderer, a rat. But Gravano's testimony was consistent, detailed, backed up by the wiretaps. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He died in prison in 2002. Frank Licasio, the consigliere, also got life. And Sammy Gravano, 5 years. He'd already served 4, less than 1 additional year. Then, witness protection.
The aftermath. 1994. Gravano entered the Witness Protection Program. New name, new identity, moved to Arizona with his family, lived as Jimmy Moran, a small-time businessman. But his cooperation didn't stop with Gotti. Over the next 6 years, Gravano testified in multiple trials. Vincent the Chin Gigante, Genovese boss, Victor Little Vic Orena, Colombo boss, dozens of other mobsters. The government stated, as a result of Gravano's testimony, there had been 37 convictions, 9 people awaiting trial, 8 people resigned from unions. He arguably destroyed organized crime in New York more than any other witness in history. But in 2000, Gravano was arrested again. Ecstasy trafficking. He'd left witness protection, started a drug ring in Arizona with a son. In 2001, he pleaded guilty, 20 years in prison. He served 17 years, released in September 2017. Today, Gravano is 79 years old. He runs a podcast, gives interviews, appears on talk shows. He's written books, done documentaries. And despite breaking omerta, despite testifying against 30 dozen mobsters, he's still alive. The mob families that wanted him dead are gone. The bosses he testified against are dead. The new generation doesn't care as much about the old grudges. Sammy the Bull Gravano outlived them all. 1975, Canarsie, Brooklyn. A car pulled up to the Gemini Lounge on Flatlands Avenue. 3 men got out. One of them was Andre Katz, a member of Roy DeMeo's car theft ring who'd agreed to cooperate with authorities. Katz thought he was attending a business meeting. He was led through his side door, not into the bar, into an apartment behind it. Joseph Guglielmo, nicknamed Dracula, rented the place. The crew called it Horror Hotel. Inside the small apartment, Roy DeMeo waited. 6'2", 230 pounds, former butcher's apprentice. He held a .22 caliber pistol with a silencer and a towel. Katz barely had time to register what was happening. DeMeo shot him in the head, immediately wrapped the towel around the wound like a turban to stanch the blood flow. Another crew member stabbed Katz in the heart to stop the blood from pumping out of the gunshot wound. The body was dragged to the bathtub, hung upside down, all remaining blood drained into the tub. Then came the dismemberment. DeMeo and his crew placed the corpse on plastic sheets spread across the apartment floor. Using knives, saws, and a butcher's precision, they cut off the arms, the legs, the head. They double-bagged each piece, packed them in cardboard boxes, drove to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn, and tossed them in. 2 days later, a homeless man found a body part while searching for food. Police recovered most of Andre Katz, minus the crushed head and genitals, but they couldn't identify him. No fingerprints, no dental records, just dismembered pieces of a human being. This is the story of Roy DeMeo, the Gambino family hitman who killed between 150
and 200 people. How a butcher's apprentice became the most prolific contract killer in American Mafia history. How he perfected a method so efficient that it became known as the Gemini method, named after the bar where he committed most of his murders. And how in January 1983, he became a victim of his own system. The Butcher's Apprentice. September 7th, 1940, Flatlands, Brooklyn. Roy Albert DeMeo was born to Antonio Joseph DeMeo, a laundry company delivery man, and Eleanor DeMeo, fourth of 5 children, working-class Italian immigrant family from Formia in the Lazio region. Young Roy was bullied constantly, smaller than the other kids, awkward, picked on. The loss of his older brother in World War II left a deep impact. Roy became withdrawn, angry. By high school, he'd found an outlet: crime. He ran a small-scale loan sharking operation while still a student, lending money to classmates at high interest rates, collecting debts with threats of violence. After graduating in 1959, Roy got a job as an apprentice butcher at a local grocery store. He learned to cut meat, separate joints, remove bones, dismember animal carcasses efficiently, skills that would serve him well later. By the mid-1960s, Roy DeMeo was working for Anthony Nino Gaggi, a made member of the Gambino crime family with ties back to Albert Anastasia in the 1950s. Gaggi ran loan sharking operations, DeMeo collected debts, beat up delinquent borrowers, earned a reputation for ruthlessness. In 1966, Roy married Gladys Rosamond. They moved to Massapequa, Long Island, a quiet suburban neighborhood, had 2 children, Albert and Lisa. To his neighbors, Roy was a successful used car dealer. He drove nice cars, dressed well, coached his son's little league team. At night, he was building the most efficient murder operation in Mafia history.
The crew. Late 1960s, DeMeo assembled his crew. Joseph Joey Testa and Anthony Tony Center, inseparable childhood friends. They'd later become known as the Gemini Twins for their partnership in murder. Chris Rosenberg, a young Jewish criminal with connections to drug trafficking. Henry Borelli, Freddie DeNome, and Vito Arena each brought different skills: muscle, connections, willingness to kill. By the early 1970s, the DeMeo crew was operating multiple rackets: car theft, drug trafficking, loan sharking, pornography, prostitution. They ran an international auto theft ring, stealing cars in New York, altering VINs, and selling them overseas or in other states. Massive profits, hundreds of thousands per month. But the crew's reputation came from murder. When someone crossed the Mayo, they disappeared completely. No body, no evidence, no closure for families. That's because the Mayo had perfected his method. The Gemini method. 1977. The apartment behind the Gemini Lounge became the crew's slaughterhouse. The Mayo had bought the bar in the mid-70s, a neighborhood dive, working-class clientele, nothing fancy. But behind the bar, his cousin, Joseph Guglielmo, lived in a small apartment, silver-haired, paranoid, creepy. The crew called him Dracula. Dracula allowed the crew to use his apartment for their weekly business meetings and for murder. The method was clinical. Step 1. Lure the victim to the apartment. Use a side door outside the bar. Never bring them through the main entrance where customers might see. Step 2. The Mayo, almost always him, according to crew member Frederick DeNome, would approach with a silenced .22 pistol in one hand and a towel in the other. He'd shoot the victim once in the head, then immediately wrap the towel around the wound like a turban. This staunched blood flow and prevented splattering. Step 3. Another crew member, originally Chris Rosenberg, would stab the victim in the heart. This stopped the heart from pumping blood out of the gunshot wound. Step 4. The body would be stripped and dragged to the bathroom, hung upside down in the bathtub. All remaining blood drained into the tub or congealed in the body. Once drained, the corpse was placed on plastic sheets in the main room. Using knives, saws, ice picks, and butcher tools, the crew dismembered it. Arms, legs, head, everything separated. Step 6. Body parts were double-bagged in plastic, packed into cardboard boxes, and driven to the Fountain Avenue dump or other industrial disposal sites across Brooklyn. Step 7. The head was usually crushed in a trash compactor or the genitals removed to prevent identification through dental records or DNA. The method was horrifyingly efficient. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence. The Mayo's motto: no body, no crime. Between 1973 and 1983, the DeMayo crew murdered an estimated 75 to 200 people using this method. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Walter Mack later said, "I would say somewhere between 150 to 200 is a good number."
The Horror Hotel. Living in the apartment where murders happened, where bodies hung in the bathtub draining blood, was Joseph Dracula Guglielmo. He slept there, showered in the same tub where victims' blood had run down the drain. Crew members found him disturbing, but DeMayo trusted him. Dracula never talked, never complained, just provided the space and stayed quiet. The apartment became known as Horror Hotel, a slaughterhouse masquerading as a residence. And the murders continued, week after week, month after month, year after year. Most victims were criminals, car theft ring members who stole from DeMayo, drug dealers who crossed him, informants who cooperated with authorities. But not all. In 1979, an 18-year-old college student knocked on DeMayo's house. He was selling vacuum cleaners door to door. DeMayo thought he was a Cuban hitman from an ongoing dispute. He fired shots at the kid. The terrified teenager tried to drive away. DeMayo chased him. In broad daylight, in front of horrified witnesses, DeMayo leapt from his car and shot the boy dead. An innocent civilian, murdered because DeMayo was paranoid. His son Albert later wrote that when DeMayo realized the truth, he broke down crying. The murder of an innocent boy affected him deeply, but it also drew massive attention. Nino Gaggi took notice. Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss, was furious. This wasn't the discreet method DeMayo had perfected. This was reckless, public, dangerous. The FBI started investigating harder. The unraveling. By 1982, the FBI was closing in. They'd linked DeMayo to dozens of missing persons. They'd identified the Gemini Lounge as a murder site. They'd placed the crew under constant surveillance. Vito Arena, one of the crew members, was arrested June 4, 1982 for a string of robberies. Facing decades in prison, Arena cooperated. He testified about the murders, the dismemberments, the Gemini method, everything. Other crew members panicked. If Arena was talking, they'd all be indicted. DeMayo and several associates went into hiding during summer and fall 1982. But DeMayo eventually emerged to consult with lawyers. A grand jury subpoenaed him in late 1982 to testify in a racketeering case. Paul Castellano realized DeMayo had become a liability. The FBI attention, the reckless murder of the vacuum salesman, the crew members turning informant. DeMayo knew too much about Castellano, about the Gambino family, about murders committed on Castellano's orders, including Frank Amato, Castellano's own son-in-law, who'd abused Castellano's daughter. If the Mayo cooperated to avoid prison, the entire Gambino hierarchy would fall. Castellano allegedly first asked John Gotti and his brother Gene to kill the Mayo. They refused. The Mayo's crew was too dangerous. They'd seek revenge. So Castellano ordered the Mayo's own crew to do it. Joey Testa and Anthony Senta were given the contract. January 10th, 1983, the Mayo disappeared. He'd been driving a new 1983 Cadillac registered in his wife's name. In the trunk was a chandelier from his Long Island home that it had intended to have repaired. He never made it to the repair shop. January 20th, 1983, the Mayo's body was found in the trunk of his car, frozen solid, multiple gunshots to the head. He'd been killed by members of his own crew, men he'd trained, men he'd trusted. The architect of the Gemini method died the same way his victims had, shot in the head, body hidden in a trunk. Richard the Iceman Kuklinski later confessed to killing the Mayo, though investigators doubt the claim. Most believe Testa and Senta did it on Castellano's orders.
The legacy. The DeMeo crew was the most violent murder squad ever prosecuted in federal court. Between 1973 and 1983, they killed an estimated 150 to 200 people. Most bodies were never found. Most victims were never identified. The Gemini method revolutionized organized crime's approach to murder, its efficiency, its clinical precision, its ability to make bodies completely disappear. Other crews copied the technique. Law enforcement had to develop new strategies to investigate cases where no body existed. In 1984, Paul Castellano and 20 other defendants, including surviving DeMeo crew members, faced federal allegations including the car theft ring, 25 related murders, drug trafficking, loan sharking, extortion, fraud, and prostitution. Joey Testa and Anthony Senta were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Both are still incarcerated. The Gemini Lounge closed. The apartment behind it was eventually demolished. But Roy DeMeo's name still sends chills through the underworld. The butcher's apprentice, who became the Mafia's most prolific killer. The man who turned murder into an assembly line. He killed for business, he killed for pleasure, he killed because someone crossed him, or because someone might talk, or because he was paranoid that an 18-year-old vacuum salesman was actually a Cuban hitman. And in the end, he died the same way he'd killed hundreds of others, shot in the head, body in a trunk, left to be found as a message.